Here it is, guys, our very own senior leader, Mark Pomery, taking week 3 of Anxious for Nothing.
Well, hey there, Elevate friends and family. Great to have you with us today. Special shout out to those of you joining us from the UK, those of you joining us from Kenya, from Egypt, and of course, wherever else it is that you're joining us from. It's great to have you here today for what is week 3 of our series, Anxious for Nothing. And both the title and the inspiration for this series comes from something that Paul wrote. Paul was a leader in the early church. Wrote to the church in Philippi, and let me read it to you. He wrote to them, and this is a letter, and this was towards the end of the letter. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And that first slice, do not be anxious about anything, or we've called this series Anxious for Nothing. We're kind of asking the question, is this realistic or ridiculous? And we've been going through a little bit of an examination of that and maybe angling towards the potential for this to be realistic and not ridiculous. Strongly encourage you to, if you've missed out on week 1 or week 2, or you just want to kind of hit it again, check out our podcast. You can find that on pretty much all of the major podcast platforms. Just type in Elevate Church Perth and hey presto, we'll be there. But it's important, this topic of anxiety, because it is so prevalent, and it's important on an individual level to understand that the early signs of anxiety are like a smoke alarm. You hear the sound of your smoke alarm in your house, and it suggests that if you don't do something, things are going to get pretty ugly pretty quickly. And so it's a positive thing in that setting because it hopefully evokes a response. You need to act. You need to, and in the case of anxiety, seek some help, establish some deeper connections, do whatever it takes to really tackle the thing that's causing you to be anxious. And just like a smoke alarm, if you ignore it, or what I know some people have done, if you disconnect it because you got sick of it beeping, then unfortunately, chances are you're just going to burn the house down. It's actually a good thing if we respond appropriately. Now, I'm going to get a bit sciencey today, and we love science, so God's not, first of all, afraid of science, and in fact, science is typically uncovering just how incredibly well designed God made humanity, the universe, and so on. So this is a bit of Brain 101. So inside our head, there's a brain, yes. 2 parts of the brain are the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is kind of like a bit of an almond-shaped part of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex is at the front. And these 2 parts of the brain perform very vital functions. The amygdala is the part of the brain that's wired for survival. It's designed to protect. It sends you the message, you're in trouble. There's danger ahead. In fact, it's the amygdala sending off this signal that triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response, because it senses something is potentially about to go poorly for you, and it releases a dose of adrenaline so that you can respond effectively and appropriately to the danger. The prefrontal cortex controls logic and reason. Now, these are designed to go together. These are designed to work together. You know, the fight or flight, use your words, Mark, response is critical. It's kept us alive as a species for tens of thousands of years. It's helpful until it's not. See, the problem with the amygdala is it's not objective. It doesn't kind of logically work through the danger. It just kind of senses it, triggers an alarm, and then after we've hopefully appropriately responded to the threat of danger, the prefrontal cortex kicks in and says, okay, everything's okay, you're out of danger, you're safe, you can relax again. The problem is that the amygdala can take over, what science calls an amygdala hijack, which some of you might have experienced if you've experienced anxiety and it's got a little bit irrational. You know, you've kind of sensed something might go wrong. You've started to worry about something that might happen in the future that you're not keen on. And your prefrontal cortex says, you're being ridiculous. You know, that hasn't happened. It's probably not going to happen. And your amygdala has taken over and says, no, shut up. I'm in charge here. And this kind of irrational worry, the worst case scenario starts to become your pattern of thinking. Now, a lot of today's message is very much a companion to an entire series we taught in 2021 called Winning the War in Your Mind. And again, go back on our podcast, find that, listen to it, and it'll just really unpack this a lot more. But, you know, this series, Winning the War with Your Mind, the big idea around that is to think about what you think about and get better at managing your thought life. We've been saying the last couple of weeks around this topic of anxiety and some of the motivation for teaching on this topic is that we live in a culture that there is still a level of stigma attached, negative stigma attached to anxiety. You know, in some settings, if you're seen to be struggling with anxiety, you can be looked on as weak. And then in the church, in some parts of the church, there's another layer added to that, and that's that, well, you obviously have a lack of faith. You know, you're not trusting God in that, and that's why it's leading you to be anxious. And this is just bonkers, because if you break your leg, ideally, hopefully, you're going to go to the hospital. And when you do, I can't even think of a rational human that's going to look at you and judge you as being weak. I can't think of a rational church person that's going to look at you and think, you've gone to the hospital, you obviously have a lack of faith. No, you've gone to get help. So why does anybody criticize someone else, someone who's struggling with anxiety and who may, hopefully, be reaching out for help? See, the problem is when we look at and stigmatize people with any sort of anxiety challenges and issues in that space, is that the risk is that they feel that they can't be honest. They can't expose that they're struggling with this. They don't want to be sort of labeled as weak or labeled as have a lack of faith. And so the risk is that they kind of bury it or pretend, keep things off the table. But God can't heal what we hide. It's critical that we present our struggles to God, and it's critical that we become people, and we are a church who encourages that, who celebrates that, who journeys with people, who prays for people, who encourages people, who speaks life into people who are putting their struggles on the table in the light where God can do something. Now, admittedly, we're not angling this series as if we're counselors or as if we're trained doctors or if we're trained nutritionists, all of whom can play a role in helping you if and when you're struggling with anxiety. What we do know is that God has gifted people to be counselors, and they've gone into training and they've responded to God's gifting and their temperament and their personality, and they want to help people. And God plus counselors, God working with the counselor, God working through the counselor, can help you. So you very much are trusting God, trusting that God and God working through the counselor will help you. God and the doctor, God and the nutritionist. It's not a lack of faith, it's actually a demonstration of faith. I trust that God's going to use this individual to help me in this situation. But here's one thing that undergirds everything, and I just strongly encourage all of us at all times, and just this very thought that I'm about to drop kind of speaks to whether Paul's instruction or encouragement, don't be anxious about anything, isn't ridiculous, and it is realistic. And it's simply this: you know that God's actually seated on the throne? He's not frantically pacing. He's not tossing and turning. He's not anxious or nervous. He's seated, steady, and secure. You know, we say that he's got the whole world in his hands. Do you know what? That includes you and me and our circumstances. He's seated. He's not anxious. He's not pacing. And so we can take that as our foundation, and we can add to that help from professionals that have been trained, that can help us. Wise people get help from wise people. Okay, that's kind of the setup. And we've been double-clicking on that every single week in various ways because it's such an important thing for all of us to wrap our heads around. All right, let me drop you into something else that Paul wrote, continuing in his same letter. If you've got your smart device, your double screening somehow maybe, scan this flow code. It's going to take you to that same letter, to the same chapter of that letter, Philippians chapter 4. And again, this is Paul writing to the church in Philippi. He's a church leader. He's actually now imprisoned for sharing about Jesus. Yowzers. And now he's really getting to the end of the letter. So he writes this: summing it all up, friends, I'd say you'll do best by filling your minds and meditating on things true, noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious, the best, not the worst, the beautiful, not the ugly, things to praise, not to curse. Do that, and God, who makes everything work together, will work you into his most excellent harmonies. Fill your minds and meditate. He's giving us very practical instruction. Some time ago, and over the period of several years, I worked alongside some air traffic controllers. Here's the thing about air traffic controllers. They don't control which planes come into their airspace. That's done by external decision makers. But they do have the authority to determine which planes get to land on their runway. And they do have the authority to reroute some planes if, for whatever reason, landing that plane on their runway is considered dangerous. And with our thoughts, we can employ that very same principle, the rerouting principle. Yeah, we can't control every thought that comes into and circles our headspace, but we can control which thoughts we allow to land. We have the authority to reroute thoughts, to not allow them to fill our minds. And it's going to take some practice. Rest assured, air traffic controllers don't just sign up, to an ad online that says no experience necessary, get the job and start controlling the air traffic the next day. No, they go through rigorous training, extensive training, and then they continue with ongoing training because there's a lot at stake. Well, it's the same for you and I. Wherever we are today, whatever our starting point is, I encourage us to become effective thought traffic controllers and get better at recognizing the thoughts and then triaging which ones we're going to allow to land in our headspace and which ones we're going to reroute and tell them to go somewhere else. See, the fact is what goes on in our mind comes out in our life. And so what we have, what we think about, what thoughts we allow to land really, really, really matter. And then there's this intimation of the replacement principle, filling your minds and meditating. Last week, Rob taught about the idea of starting an elimination diet in our minds when it comes to certain negative thoughts. And he just said, just start with one, one thought that enters your headspace. Don't allow it to land, reroute it. And it's so powerful, such an important principle. But here's the thing. That's only one side of the coin. So I'm going to add to that. I'm going to add to what Rob said last week. Now, I'm the Chief Growing Officer, the CGO of Marco's Urban Farm. And if there's one thing that I've learned, it is that whenever you pull a weed out of your garden or urban farm, if you just leave that space barren, then it's only a matter of time until another weed takes its place. And so what's essential is to both eliminate and then fill with something else. Eliminate a negative thought, eliminate an anxious thought, and then fill our minds with something in that space. Fill our minds with a life-giving thought, with an encouraging thought, with an affirming thought. And Paul gives us his top 9 to choose from. And I'm going to revisit that in a moment. And he says, though, don't just fill our minds with those sorts of thoughts like as a once-off thing. He then also says meditate on them, that they have to become our continual focus. And if we do that, if we fill our minds and meditate on these life-giving thoughts, it's literally going to change the trajectory of our thinking and ultimately, therefore, change the trajectory of our lives. So let me go back to it. Here's Paul's top 9. If a thought doesn't fall into one or more of these categories, reroute it and replace it with a thought that does fall into one of these categories. Is it true? Is it noble? Like worthy of a king? Is this what God's kind of thinking about you and your situation? Is it reputable? Like, who's telling you this? Is it authentic? Like, does it actually match up to the reality of the circumstances that you're in? Is it compelling? Like, is it taking you forward or is it driving you backwards? Is it gracious? Not legalistic or onerous or overly burdensome, but is it something that you think this is actually going to help me move towards freedom in my thinking and my life? Is it the best, not the worst? You know, this speaks to altitude. Like think at a high altitude, and in due course, you'll find yourself living at a higher altitude. Is it beautiful, not ugly? I don't think that requires any explanation. And is it praise, not a curse? And by the way, praise isn't limited to our circumstances. You can praise God even in the midst of negative circumstances, which, by the way, Paul was writing this very letter whilst in prison. I said it already. And he said, praise God, be thankful, rejoice. Hello. Not tied to, tethered to, limited by negative circumstances. And look, he offers this up as an antidote to anxiety, that by rerouting and replacing, that over time, the trajectory of our thinking and therefore the trajectory of our lives will actually change and improve and go towards the direction that God wants for us in our lives. Hey, final thing. We have been loving that the Bible app about 3 months ago added a feature, and that is to allow us to add Elevate Church as My Church. They added the My Church feature in the Bible app. So all you need to do is scan this. Now, if you're like fumbling around, like just go back to this video, like rewind when we're done, and scan this QR code. It's going to take you to the Bible app. You have to have the app installed and have logged in. And it's going to allow you to set Elevate Church as My Church. Now, one of the benefits of that, and one of the things we're loving about that, is it's got a feature called Featured Plan. And so what we're doing every Monday is we're uploading a featured plan that echoes and builds on the very topic we've taught on the weekend. And that's allowing us together to dig deeper, to encourage one another, to really say, God, you know, let me grow even further than just hearing the message one off. So we'd love you to do that. It's free. We're not selling anything apart from life, I guess. Look, hey, next week we're going to land this series. Rob's going to be back. It's going to be fantastic. We'd love to see you then. Bring somebody. Don't forget to share this video with somebody that you know would benefit from it. Just like, hey, check this out. Thinking of you. And we'll see you back here next week.